Good morning. I'm glad to see you all here. Welcome to Twin Valley Bible Chapel Sunday School. And we're going to look into the corruption of our culture and how we got here. So let's bow with a word of prayer and then we'll begin. Father, we do thank you for this time that we can have together. I ask your blessing on it. Give us wisdom, give us understanding as I go through these things. Help me to say what you once said, and help us to honor you through all of this. Well, thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, we looked at the two major worldviews previously, one based on biblical theology and the other based on man's ideas, philosophy. And we looked at how philosophy deviated from theology. And finally, how we came to the point where we think we are gods ourselves. And we don't need another God. Remember the progression that philosophy actually went through. And initially they assumed that there was a God. Then they questioned God. Then they got to the point where they denied God. And then we got to the point where we are today, where we can become our own God. And we looked at the culture and what makes it work and endure. It needs a solid foundation rooted in biblical revelation. One that defines reality and anchors meaning. We need those kinds of things as a people. We need a fixed reference point for who we are, why we exist, what's right and wrong, and where we are headed. A society, a culture, in order to sustain itself, has to have a cohesive mindset, a coherent story. We have to be on the same page. If we're not on the same page, it's not going to work. And we can see that today. So, what we have left to go through in this course in the next 3 or 4 weeks, 5 weeks, I think. Today I want to look at the collapse of the American culture. And then I want to look at the last 2 chapters of the Bible story. Remember, I pointed out that the Bible can be condensed into 4 chapters. There is creation, the fall, redemption, and revelation. We pretty much, although not specifically, looked at creation simply by looking at a biblical foundation for culture, for society, what we believe, how we act. Okay, based on a biblical culture that was given to us all in creation in the first 2 chapters of Genesis. We looked at the fall from the point of view of how philosophy and ideas deviated from the truth. And now today I want to look at how that has affected American culture and what we can do for it. Coming up, I want to look at redemption, the 3rd chapter in God's plan. That is when He intervenes to reclaim what was lost. And He starts a process by which He restores everything to what He initially wanted it to be. And that's restoration. So that is where we are, and what we are going to do now is look at how we actually got here. We looked at the American culture. We started with a biblical foundation. There is a God. He has revealed Himself to us. And most of the original colonies that we started out with were started by Christians. Religious belief, especially Protestant Christianity, was a major driver for many colonial founders. We'll look at that in a little detail in just a minute. The defining characteristics of our society, of our culture, have been, from the beginning, truth. That is reality defined by divine revelation. It's based in an education aimed to form character in truth and wisdom. And it's a justice that reflected God's righteousness. Truth. Second one is virtue. We were morally responsible. We got that. We understood that. We knew what was expected of us as individuals and in communities. We recognized that sex and ethics were grounded in covenant and dignity. And work was seen as a vocation, not self-fulfillment, or not a necessary evil, as it often is today. So we had truth and virtue, and we also had family. The family was a foundational piece. It was a covenant community. The family was a moral incubator, raising children to know and understand God and to know and understand righteousness. It was an identity rooted in creation, not self-construction. And then there was trust. Truth, virtue, family, and trust. Institutions were built on trust. In politics, authority was seen as service toward God. It's why we call people public servants today. They were seen as servants, not as rulers. And we've lost some of that as well. And then purpose. Truth, virtue, family, trust, and purpose. We recognized from the beginning that human beings were endowed with dignity. They had a design, a purpose, and a destiny. We recognize that science and discovery were acts of worship, not mere utility. So, for instance, Johannes Kepler said, when he came up with something and found a discovery, he would say, I am merely thinking God's thoughts after him. That was their mindset. That was their purpose. It reflected the idea that scientific discovery is not inventing truth, but uncovering the rational structure that God already placed into the universe. This was the soil from which the American dream grew. Truth, virtue, family, trust, and purpose created a society of opportunity. It promised that through hard work, moral integrity, and personal responsibility, anybody could flourish. It was never just about material success, although that was there. It was also about dignity, a legacy that we could leave, and a freedom that we had under God. We could pursue things, and we could achieve a nice lifestyle. We could be successful. Those values also formed a moral and relational glue that held American culture together. Basically, people all had the same mindset. They understood truth and virtue, family, trust, and all the rest of them. They were passed down through a shared story. We looked at that, the impact of story last week, how the story of a people can hold them together, how Israel's story has held them together throughout generations, throughout all kinds of adversities. That story that God gave them from the calling of Abraham all the way to the death of Christ has held them together as a people. They are what they are today, and they still hold to that identity because that story was strong and it was repeated. We need that. So where are we? Well, thanks to the philosophers of the 18th and 19th century, we have lost most of the cohesion that we had known. The philosophical seeds of fragmentation have implanted themselves. We are not a unified people. That should be obvious. Friedrich Nietzsche gave us the idea of expressive individualism, radical individualism. You're your own man, and you need to just be by yourself, so to speak. For him, all men were an island unto themselves. And he didn't recognize that, no, we are not islands unto ourselves. He advocated the death of truth, that there were no absolutes, only perspectives. Jean-Paul Sartre said everyone is their own God and defined reality any way they want. And Rousseau came along and said, all I can trust is my mind. You need to distrust institutions. And he advocated that children should not be taught by their parents because parents will pass on all the bad things that they have accumulated. They should be taught by instructors trained to let the children think for themselves. Education should protect their natural state. He believed that children were born innocent and corrupted by society. To avoid that, we needed to be very careful. That undermined the family and the authority of the family in the home. People today let their children do whatever they want for fear that they'll corrupt them. That comes from him. The cultural fruits of self-definition started exposing themselves. We have now sexuality and gender. From divine design, we came to the point where we declare our own identity. I can be whatever I want to be. Truth and authority has left, and we went from revelation to relativism. I am now my own authority. I define truth for myself. That's my truth. That's not your truth, we might hear people say. We went from purpose and meaning to whatever I do for myself. I don't do for God. I am my own authority again. We lost community and belonging. And we lost a good education. Education went from forming forming cultural values, forming biblical values in a person, to teaching for guiding for self-discovery. Let the kids decide for themselves what they think is right and wrong. We saw the collapse of Christianity, how Christianity's retreat from cultural engagement accelerated moral and institutional collapse. The church today is no longer relevant. Witness the fact that churches were closed during the COVID panic and nobody or very few people argued against it. Bars and strip clubs were allowed to remain open. That should give you an idea of where our heads were. Churches had to close, but bars and strip clubs could remain open. As one person said, the church, as a lighthouse, turned off during the storm. It's not a good thing. And a lot of churches never argued against it. And if the church doesn't speak when worship is restricted, is it still salt and light? We saw the collapse of marriage and morality. Marriage is down, having children is down, adultery is up, immorality is up. We have a rise in crime, in protests, in violence, suicide, and drug abuse. Actually totally because we have lost the foundations that give people purpose and meaning. They're finding their own, but it's not a good find. Our new parameters now, well, actually our old parameter was the biblical view: you are not your own, you're bought with a price. The new view is, I am my own and I define my own price. It's not a place to be, not a good place to be. We have gender confusion. Biology is optional and self-perception is sovereign. We have teenage rebellion. Authority is oppressive. Autonomy is sacred. And obviously we have sex and promiscuity. Sex becomes consumption rather than a covenant in marriage. Desire defines morality, and restraint is repression. How did we get here? This didn't happen overnight. Seems like it happened overnight, but it didn't. 1620, Plymouth, the Pilgrims landed and started this new continent in a very real sense. Because of its strong spiritual roots and tradition of descent, New England became a center point for the Revolution and for the start of independence. The Jamestown colony was earlier. It predated Plymouth by 13 years, but it was a predominantly cultural venture and a profit-making venture. It was marked by instability, high morality, and profit-driven motives. That made Plymouth the better option for the start of the country, and that's exactly what happened. The Mayflower Compact resonated later with the ideals of the Founding Fathers. Their spiritual and civic foundation thrust them into the forefront of American identity. In 1776, our foundations were laid. That's when it all came together. A synthesis of centuries of thought, biblical, classical, and Enlightenment, all came together for a framework that created our nation as it is today. The Founding Fathers used the ideas of philosophers judiciously, not just carelessly. They valued John Locke, a philosopher, who championed individual natural rights given by God. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which Jefferson entered into the Declaration of Independence, come from John Locke. But he stated it differently. His wording, John Locke's wording, was life, liberty, and property. Those were foundational for him. They were natural and they were discoverable by reason, according to John Locke. Jefferson reworded it by eliminating property because the South viewed the slaves as property, and he did not want that in the Declaration. He was opposed to that. So he changed property to pursuit of happiness. He believed in the natural law that John Locke advocated, but he understood that that is not discoverable by reason. It is inherent in us by God himself. It has been implanted in us. We see that in Romans chapter 2, verse 15, where Paul says, which show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, their thoughts, the meanwhile accusing or excusing one another. Jefferson adapted Locke's idea of natural rights and said, yes, they are there, but they are implanted in us by God. That's different. So in the Declaration, when he addresses this, he doesn't say just the laws of nature. He says the laws of nature and of nature's God. He is grounding the right to revolution in a higher moral order. I find that fascinating. They went to Charles Montesquieu for separation of powers and checks and balances. And they used a passage in Isaiah. I don't have the verse in front of me at the moment. But basically in Isaiah, God is talking to Israel, or Israel is talking to God, and he says, "For he is our lawmaker, he is our judge, and he is our king." Those are the three branches of government: lawmaker, judge, and king. They are in Isaiah. I am not aware that the founding fathers were aware of that passage, although I think they were. But it very clearly indicates the pattern that they put in place. Keep in mind, these founding fathers were taught how to read and write using the Bible, either by their mom or by a pastor in the local community. Using the Bible as your textbook is going to embed a whole lot of ideas that you don't realize are there, but you accept them as normal, as natural. And this happened with them. Also keep in mind, these men, some of them were not alive. A couple were alive during the, I can't think of the word I want. George Whitefield, the Great Awakening. A couple of them were alive. They were kids, but they were alive during the Great Awakening. But all of them were raised in the aftermath of that great revival in America. They knew what was going on. They used a lot of other ideas from the philosophers of old, very old, the Greeks and the Romans. But similar to Augustine and Aquinas, and their judicious use of Plato and Aristotle, they very carefully hand-selected the ideas that they liked and that would fit and would not violate their biblical principles. They also used the King James Bible. Its moral language and themes of justice and covenant shaped the founders' worldview. They were not necessarily Christians by birth, by second birth, but what we would call the new birth. But they certainly understood biblical Christian principles, and they used them. They put that all in place, and as a result, we have one of the most famous sentences in the English language. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with natural, inalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A lot of people, I would think most of the people in the world, know that sentence. And it has been the theme of a lot of revolutions, civil rights movements, constitutional democracies worldwide. And they had an inspiring preamble. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them, it requires that they should declare the causes that impel them to the separation. That's a shortened version of it, but what they're saying is we come to the point where we realize a revolution is necessary, but we see it as important that we let you know why. And they wrote the Declaration of Independence. They were more successful than most others because of the theological foundation they had. They were anchored in moral clarity, covenantal thinking, and transcendent accountability. They knew who they were, they knew their God, and they knew the responsibilities that set on them. Then we come to 1800, and we find the first seeds of conflict and rationalization. Declaration of Constitution made two fatal mistakes that were not necessarily seen at the time. One, they excluded women from any participation in civic life by the wording they used. Abigail Adams wrote to John Adams and said, "Don't forget the women." They did. And the language of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution reflected and reinforced a legal and cultural system that excluded women from civic life. We can look at that and say, well, all men created equal. We know men as generic. It means everybody. In that day, it did not mean everybody. In their language, in their culture, to use the word man only meant man only. So they deliberately left the women out. Get to that in a minute because that has ramifications. They also failed to adequately address the issue of slavery. Jefferson and others were conflicted over this issue. On the one hand, they hated slavery. Jefferson, Patrick Henry, all of them. I have Washington, all of them. I have quotes from them saying how much they hated that, but they had them. Jefferson had 600 slaves. And on one hand, they hated slavery, and they held to a moral standard they wrote into the Constitution. On the other hand, slavery was essential for the success of the colonies, for the stability of the colonies. I want to read something. Jefferson was one member of 5 members who wrote the Declaration of Independence. He wrote it and submitted it to this council, to this committee. He had a lengthy paragraph in there condemning slavery and condemning King George in no uncertain terms. They decided to reject that and not leave it in the Declaration. I want to read that to you. He, King George III, has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere or to incur miserable death in their transportation there. The piratical warfare, the opprobrium of infidel powers, is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. He's being sarcastic. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative. That is, he corrupted his veto power and used it to keep that situation in place. He has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable, utterly abhorrent commerce. And that this assemblage of horrors might want no fact of distinguished eye, he is exciting those very people to rise up in arms among us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them by murdering the people on whom he has obtruded them, forced them, thus paying off former crimes committed against the liberties of one people with crimes which he urged them to commit against the lives of others. In no uncertain terms, he is saying this is an abhorrent thing, and the King of England is upholding it. That comes from the fact that Jefferson authored and submitted 3 resolutions to condemn the slave trade in the Virginia House when he was a representative there. They were all sent to the governor. The governor, under orders from the king, vetoed all of them and would not let it happen. So, with this, why didn't Jefferson free his slaves? He's obviously conflicted. Well, one, it was very difficult in Virginia. There were penalties. If an owner released their slaves, those slaves were required to leave the state in 1 year or be re-enslaved. They could be re-enslaved by anybody. And the owner would necessarily bear the cost of resettling them somewhere else. That became pretty expensive. So it wasn't easy to just free the slaves, even though they might have wanted to. There was also a fear that freed slaves would be persecuted and mistreated. There was already rising in the colonies a sense of racial discrimination, and blacks were looked down on. The economics of the day made it difficult not to have them, free men, and so they needed slaves in order to work the plantations. Well, you say, why didn't they get rid of the slaves and hire other workers? Because white workers didn't want to do that job. We hear that same argument today. We need the immigrants because white people won't pick the crops. Same argument. And it was there as well. And that all prevented them from actually releasing the slaves. But the fact that they were conflicted and the fact that they did not fully address that in the Declaration and in the Constitution led to, I lost my place here, led to a conflict that was not resolved, and with the women. So, in 1848, the first of the cracks appear. First wave, what they call first wave feminism begins. Women in colonial America were effectively second-class citizens. And here's my quote. Abigail Adams famously urged her husband to remember the ladies, warning that women would rebel if denied representation. In 1848, 2 women were denied the right to speak at an anti-slavery convention. They came back and started a convention that is called the Seneca Falls Convention, where they listed a list of grievances similar to the Declaration of Independence, and that has become a foundational text for feminist advocacy. And it was grounded as well in the rights outlined by John Locke and others, and molded on the Declaration of Independence. That's the first break that we see in America. Not a major one, but it was a start. Also in 1848, Karl Marx writes the Communist Manifesto. And within a number of years, that spread all over Europe, creating unrest and inequality. German immigrants fleeing the uprooting and the difficulties going on there came to America with those thoughts in mind. And they started embedding that into American society. By the 1880s, they had embedded socialist ideas in the American labor unions. In 1877, the Socialist Labor Party of America is established. And Marxism made its formal entry into the culture of the United States of America. And then we have in 1861 the Civil War. That's the second unresolved conflict that breaks open. And slavery was directly challenged. The war exposed the contradiction between American ideals and the institutional realities. You couldn't enslave people if you really did believe they were all equal. And at that same time, we see racism actually becoming a thing. Before 1800s, race was not a fixed biological category. Human differences were often explained through geography, climate, or culture, but not by color of skin. Carl Linnaeus, who was big on classification, classified humans into subspecies, again, based on geography and temperament, but not color. Blumenbach, another professor at the time in 1775, proposed 5 human races, introducing the term Caucasian and ranking groups by skull shape and aesthetics. We start to see the delineation of races based on things other than geography and climate and things like that. Now, that was the start of it. And then race was used as a category to justify slavery. Bloom said, some of them have different skulls, different brain sizes, so they must be dumber, and therefore we have the racial stereotypes that we have today comes from them. A lot of philosophers contributed to this idea. Immanuel Kant, David Hume, George Hegel, Friedrich Nietzsche, all of them had input into this in their little ways. Nothing major at the time, but all of it kind of snowballed into the place where we ended up in the 1800s. Immanuel Kant thought there were racial essences tied to moral and intellectual worth. David Hume claimed that non-whites were naturally inferior, and Hegel called Africa the land of childhood. All these ideas were used to justify colonialism, slavery, eugenics, and it embedded racial hierarchies into the Western canon. One of my teachers in the class that I did said this: when anthropology is severed from theology, race becomes a tool of power, not a reflection of shared dignity. When anthropology is severed from theology, race becomes a tool of power, not a reflection of shared dignity. Anchored in theology, you don't get to the place of races being different and better or worse than others. You don't get there that way. You only do if you ignore that. In 1859, Charles Darwin introduced natural selection. Many twisted that into a social Darwinism, again, a justification for racial superiority or inferiority, depending on the color of your skin. And biology and evolution became tools to rank human value. Not a good place to be. After the Civil War, racism was embedded into society with black codes and Jim Crow laws in the South. We know or remember those things. After the Civil War, feminism expanded. One of the problems with the war is a lot of men get killed. That's a given. A lot of men got killed in the Civil War, and it upset the balance of the ratio between men and women. Now there were more men and less women around there. And they started, due to that shortage, they started stepping up into traditional male roles. And with that came an increasing awareness of the different status in civil life for the women. Once they started moving out and becoming active, they realized they were not accorded the same respect as men. And when the 15th Amendment passed, granting black men the right to vote and excluding women, that increased the break. The feminism from before the Civil War, which was embedded in moral reform like temperance and abolition, became political activism, suffrage, and civil rights. Before the war, women were seen as moral guardians of the home, influencing society indirectly. After the war, many of them demanded direct political agency, arguing that civic virtue required a voice in governance. The war totally disrupted the male-led public sphere that had existed up until that time. It fractured gender roles. Women stepped into the breach, and many of them refused to step back. This is the first disruption of the family. The home, once seen as the center of moral formation, began to lose its cultural and theological primacy. Family roles were redefined, not just by necessity, but by ideological reimagining. The door was opened to reimagine gender functions, traditional male and female roles. Chuck Colson, one of my teachers, said, when the family is redefined, the culture follows, either toward restoration or collapse. Next week, I want to look at family and all that went into disrupting the family and changing it. It's pretty scary. So that was the 1800s. We had feminism break out. We had the Civil War break out. We had racism start rearing its ugly head. In 1900, there were more changes. Industrialization and urbanization started taking place. Industry displaced the natural rhythms where farmers would judge their whole life by the time of the season. The planting, the reaping, the harvesting, the building, whatever. All of that gave way to the work to the factory. And work became tied to machines and not seasons. The factory whistle replaced the sun as a timekeeper. Again, family and church started eroding more. One of the things that happened as a result of industrialization is people started moving toward the cities where the work was and leaving the home. That meant if a son or a daughter left and went into the city, that tie with family was broken. Even though it was still there biologically, they weren't together to reinforce each other and to encourage each other. And their new family became the workers around them, whether they were of the same kind of ideas or not. And connections with family were severed. Co-workers became their new family. Marx's critique of industrialism gained traction during that time as well, as industry changes the agrarian lifestyles. By 1917, we had a revolution in China. By 1949, we had a revolution in by 1917, we had a revolution in Russia, and by 1949, we had one in China, and communism became a worldwide global threat. That impacted everything. The family in those countries was redefined as a state unit, not a sacred institution. The family existed for the benefit of the state, not because God ordained it. Human worth changed from the image of God to worth as a class laborer. What you do defined who you are, not God. In that same time, adolescence was invented as a new category. Traditionally, a child became an adult around the time of puberty. It was based on their capacity for labor, marriage, and moral responsibility. When a kid hit puberty, the parents were there to say, yeah, you're ready for moving out on your own, getting married, doing all this and whatever. And if the families decided, no, they're not quite ready, you stay in the home a little more, you learn a little more. But the family was the key, and the break point, the change point, was puberty. However, by 1918, every state had compulsory education law. That's thanks to John Dewey. And the child labor laws were implemented in order to keep children out of the mines and factories, which would seem a good thing. But then they were placed in a school for education rather than in the family. And the virtue formation, character formation, gave way to standardization. Kids were all to be pretty much the same thing. You had to achieve an A or a B, and you were seen as a reflection of those grades. Adolescence was not discovered, it was engineered. In that time, because kids were in school and not with their parents, teens as a category appeared. There had been no such thing as teenagers before this point. You were either a child or you were an adult, and puberty was the break point. Now, all of a sudden, with kids in school, teens became a category, and you had teens, you had preteens, you had tweenies, and whatever else is out there today. It was a new life stage that was fabricated between childhood and adult. Youth were removed from labor and family apprenticeship and placed into state-run institutions. That has not worked out well. And we will see that as we go on here. In 1944, we had another war, another huge amount of deaths of men, and women again stepped up to step into the breach. This time they entered the workforce en masse in order to fulfill the jobs that would have been done by the men. And necessity became the norm. Gender roles shifted again. All of a sudden, rather than male and female being complementary, they were in competition. They were both fighting for the same job, fighting for the same money. That was not a good thing. And we see the second and third wave of feminism come out with workplace, reproductive rights, sexual autonomy, identity politics, intersectionality, gender fluidity. All of those things came around because women in the workplace discovered, or thought they discovered, that they needed to be independent and free. How do you become independent and free? Well, you have to set up something on your own. Identity, untethered from creation, becomes a canvas for ideology. In other words, once we sever identity from creation, we can write on our bodies anything we want, and we can make us anything we want. During this time, sex was redefined. Freud came along and totally changed the attitude towards sex and families and sin. He reframed sin as psychological repression, not moral transgression. He undermined biblical categories of sin, repentance, and moral agency. Kinsey came along shortly after him, and based on flawed studies, he published his books basically claiming sexual behavior is diverse, natural, morally neutral, can be anything you want it to be. He had flawed data that he constructed in order to support his theories, and he used that to sever sex from marriage and from procreation, and basically make it, well, John Stonestreet, one of my friends, says it this way. He says, Kinsey's work helped shift sex from covenant to consumption, from sacred to statistical. The view changed. In 1968, there was a major cultural revolution. Sexual autonomy became sacred. We could do whatever we wanted to do. Freedom was redefined as liberation from constraint. Jonathan Cahn wrote a book called Return of the Gods. He proposed that the three main gods from Israel's past have come back, and they are now in full bloom. Baal, Ashtoreth, and Moloch, the three gods that plagued Israel throughout their whole time in the land, resurfaced. In 1989, we saw a bull placed on Wall Street. It's still there. I saw it in the news yesterday. The symbol of Baal in the Old Testament was the bull. Ashtoreth was big on sexuality, and she proposed, well, people proposed the pill free sex, and pornography. All those kinds of things were her brand in the Old Testament. And we saw them really explode in 1968. In 1969, there was a riot at a gay club in New York called Stonewall Inn. And that riot went on for a couple days, and that ended up being the starting point for the LGBTQ movement that we see today. That could happen because Kinsey and Freud and others had already undermined the idea that sex is sacred and belongs in the family, belongs in the home, between one man and one woman. Taking that out of the way, all of these things became possible. And Jonathan Cahn says that the old gods never died. They were renamed and enthroned in our culture. 2000, the fragmentation increased. We have gender confusion today. Identity becomes fluid, performative, politicized. The body is seen as raw material, not sacred design. Truth is replaced by a personal narrative, whatever I think truth is. We moved from I am created to I create myself. I have wondered, how is it that all of a sudden we see this incredible explosion of gender ideology, kids transitioning from boy to girl or girl to boy? Where did that all come from? How did that all of a sudden, it seems like it appeared overnight, in my mind. In 2000, this wasn't an issue. And all of a sudden, it's all over the place. Well, I found out. The Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, passed in 2010, had provisions in it for insurance to cover, quote, affirming care. Section 1557 of that act had a non-discrimination clause where they specifically said they could not discriminate based on gender or any of these things. It did not require insurance companies to cover gender transition and stuff like that. But when people knew that was there and they could get the state, the government, or the government, the insurance companies to pay for it, all of a sudden they wanted it more and more and more, and it exploded. And we are here today because of that. It included treatments such as hormone therapy, surgeries for individuals diagnosed with gender dysphoria, all the things that we see. The ACA did not invent gender ideology, but it institutionalized it. It embedded it into healthcare systems and insurance structures. The ACA provisions reflect a cultural re-engineering where policy reinforces worldview that sees the body as a canvas, not a calling. Our body, we can make it whatever we want it to be. We saw the rise of pornography from about 1960. It was always there. Before movies and pictures and stuff like that, it was just real in person in the temples of the gods in the Old Testament and stuff like that. But with modern technology, it became a $100 billion industry worldwide. Sex became detached from covenant. It was a product, not a promise. And relationships were reduced to consumption, not communion. The image of God was obscured by computer-generated desires. And Chuck Colson said, when intimacy is commodified, dignity is destroyed. Technology spread the ideas much quicker than ever before. They can now spread with unprecedented speed, but without any anchoring or accountability. The internet has few editors or spell checkers. And as I read articles on the internet, and I do a lot, maybe more than I should, I cannot tell you how many times I see wrong punctuation, wrong spelling, even the wrong word, because probably an autocorrect filled it out wrongly and nobody checked it. Nobody tests. They just put it out quickly in order to get people to see it, in order to get commercial advertising. And truth has become fragmented, determined by algorithms, by computer codes. Institutions have lost their authority. Glenn Sunshine, one of my professors, says technology amplifies worldview drift. It doesn't cause it, it accelerates it. And that is where I ended That is where I will end, as a matter of fact. So anyway, next week I want to take this and I want to condense it, and looking at family, at race, at sex, the various things that have been disrupted over this timeline, and put them into a perspective. That's where we go next. Thank you so much for your attention. Father, thank you for this time. Thank you for your goodness, your mercy. As we study these things and think these things, I pray, Father, that you would impress on us the need to be real and purposeful in our lives, to contend with this stuff, to beat it, in order to honor you and glorify you. And we'll thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.